A black millionaire disguised himself as a janitor in his own company. What his employees did to him was shocking, and the consequences unforgettable. James Walker was the epitome of corporate perfection. African American, 45 years old, with a commanding presence and a brilliant mind, he had built a technology empire that placed his company, Walker Innovations, among the largest in the United States. Based in San Francisco, the company was responsible for innovations that shaped the lives of millions, but success came at a price. The man behind the power spent sleepless nights worrying about the ethical issues surrounding his corporation. Rumors of high-ranking employees acting disrespectfully and arrogantly echoed through the halls, and James knew he needed to take action. Instead of blindly trusting reports or formal investigations, he decided to take a practical and unexpected approach: to infiltrate his own company. To do this, he created Raymond, an identity that contrasted drastically with his true status. A simple janitor, in worn clothes, with a humble posture and a cap that hid part of his face. The transformation was complete, and as he looked in the mirror before leaving his mansion in the morning, James could hardly recognize himself. Entering through the discreet service entrance of the massive building that housed the company headquarters, James found a world he had never seen up close. The smell of cleaning products and the sound of vacuum cleaners, creating a muffled symphony, transported him to a reality far removed from luxurious meeting rooms and private jets. He was greeted by Mary, a woman in her 60s, with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun and a warm smile that softened the wrinkles on her face. "Raymond, right?" Mary asked, with a friendly tone as she looked him up and down. "That's right," James replied, adjusting the cap to better cover his eyes. "Well, I'll show you the basics. It's nothing complicated, but we work hard around here. Oh, and a tip. Watch out for the folks up top. They're, how can I put it, demanding." She chuckled softly, but there was a hint of truth in her words that did not go unnoticed. Mary guided him through narrow hallways, showing him where the equipment was and explaining the cleaning routines. Finally, she took him to the executive floors, where the gleaming marble floor and golden details contrasted with the simplicity of James's clothes. He soon noticed the difference in treatment. While his cleaning team colleagues exchanged cordial glances and quick words, the high-ranking employees barely disguised their disdain in their looks. Some completely ignored him, while others seemed to evaluate him as if he were an out-of-place object. James began to observe everything attentively. He saw a young receptionist being publicly reprimanded by a supervisor for a trivial mistake, while a group of managers discussed projects with tones laden with sarcasm and superiority. The tension was palpable, and James began to understand that the rumors might not just be exaggerations. Despite this, he dedicated himself to the work. He wiped surfaces with precision, emptied trash cans, and kept a keen eye on the details of the environment and the interactions around him. When one of the executives dropped a folder full of documents on the floor without bothering to pick it up, James quickly bent down to help. The man merely glanced at him and muttered something unintelligible before continuing on his hurried way. On that first day, James had a clear view of the inequalities that permeated the higher floors of his company. He knew there was much more to discover, but he was ready to face the challenge. As he stored the equipment alongside Mary at the end of the shift, she patted him on the shoulder. "You did well, Raymond. You'll get used to it soon." He smiled faintly. Little did Mary know that he was already more accustomed than she imagined, but not as Raymond. As James Walker, the billionaire who now carried a mop to find answers that no one else seemed capable of providing. James began his second day as Raymond, dressed in the same simple uniform and cap that concealed his identity. He was starting to adapt to the manual labor, but he was far from getting used to the way he was treated. The executive floor, with its panoramic views of San Francisco and impeccable decor, felt like a showcase of power and wealth. However, it was also a setting of arrogance and disregard that was beginning to reveal itself in more uncomfortable details. Early in the morning, while carefully cleaning a large glass wall that faced the main corridor, James heard hurried footsteps and then a firm, cutting voice. "Make sure you don't leave a single smudge on that glass, janitor." He turned and found Kelly, a 32-year-old sales manager, standing a few meters away. She was staring at him with a look of disdain, arms crossed over her chest, waiting for his response. "Yes, ma'am." James replied, maintaining his composure and returning to work. Kelly did not seem satisfied with the simplicity of his answer and remained there for a few seconds, watching him as if inspecting a defective product before leaving with an eye roll. Later, while cleaning one of the meeting rooms, James had another unpleasant encounter. He was bent down, organizing the cables of a projector on the floor, when he felt a sudden impact on his shoulder. It was Patrick, the head of human resources, a robust 50-year-old man with an imposing appearance. He had deliberately bumped into him, and without even looking directly at James, muttered, "Stay out of the way, man." The phrase, said with indifference and an almost automatic tone, weighed more than the physical impact. James simply nodded and stepped aside, but the humiliation burned like a constant reminder of his invisible position in that environment. When the clock struck lunchtime, James headed to the cafeteria. The space was large and well-lit, decorated with modern furniture and with a view that seemed straight out of a postcard. However, the social contrast within that environment was striking. While high-ranking employees occupied the center of the hall, talking loudly and enjoying sophisticated dishes served by waiters, the janitor sat at a small table in the corner, far from the buzz. They ate in silence, almost as if they wanted to go unnoticed. James grabbed a simple tray with the standard lunch offered to employees and joined the group of janitors. The food was basic and, although nutritious, contrasted with the elaborate dishes served to the executives. He noticed that the janitors avoided eye contact with the other groups, keeping their heads down and speaking in whispers. Mary, always cordial, tried to strike up a bit of conversation, but even she seemed uncomfortable talking much in that environment. As he ate, James observed the other employees. Loud laughter and carefree conversations filled the air in the central part of the cafeteria. At a nearby table, Kelly was surrounded by colleagues, telling a story with exaggerated gestures that elicited laughter. At another table, Patrick was conversing with a group of executives, his tone indicating a mix of authoritarianism and condescension. The contrast was disconcerting. There was an invisible segregation that did not need to be verbalized to be perceived. It was not just a matter of where people sat, but of how they were seen and treated. James felt the weight of that division. He knew that as James Walker, no one would dare treat him that way. But as Raymond, he was just another ignorable presence in the corner of the room. At the end of lunch, while putting away his tray, James locked eyes with a young intern who seemed to want to say something but hesitated and moved on. It was a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but it reinforced the isolation he felt as a janitor. He took a deep breath and returned to work, determined to continue his journey and discover more about the true dynamics of power and respect within his company. As the days went by, James began to piece together a clearer picture of the environment on the executive floor. He quickly identified the main culprits behind the toxic atmosphere that permeated that space. In addition to Kelly and Patrick, there were two more figures who completed the group of the cruel: Sarah, a 40-year-old marketing manager known for her dry tone and sharp sarcasm, and Mike, a 38-year-old operations manager with an arrogant demeanor that showed in every word and gesture. Together, they seemed to form an informal alliance of superiority, which they used to belittle those they considered inferior. James watched them closely, maintaining his humble janitor posture as he swept, cleaned, or took out the trash. He noticed that the interactions of this group were not limited to work discussions. Often, they gathered in one of the offices or the meeting room to make comments that went beyond insensitivity, entering the territory of pure disrespect. One afternoon, while cleaning the hallway near the meeting room, James heard muffled voices that became clearer as he approached. It was Mike with his characteristic tone of disdain, making a loud joke. Have you ever noticed how they're always lurking, as if they want something they'll never have? The laughter that followed was unmistakable. Kelly, Patrick, and Sarah. That's true, Sarah added, with an acidic tone. I think they look at those glass walls thinking that if they clean enough, maybe one day they'll see the other side. Poor things. Maybe we should put up a sign saying "No point in dreaming," Kelly said, laughing afterward. It would save them the trouble of trying. James took a deep breath, gripping the mop handle tightly. Anger burned inside him like a flame, but he knew he needed to keep his composure. He was not just a janitor listening to abuse. He was James Walker, the man who had the power to change all of that. But his disguise depended on his ability to endure these provocations without reacting. Another incident occurred in the cafeteria when Sarah, passing by the janitor's table, deliberately dropped a cup of coffee on the floor. Instead of apologizing, she just looked at James and said with a cold smile, "Good thing you're here, Raymond. Looks like the floor needs you." She then walked away without looking back, while Kelly, who was just a few steps away, chuckled discreetly. The behavior was not limited to intentional words and gestures. James also noticed how these promoted a culture of exclusion. In the hallways, they passed by the janitors without even acknowledging their existence. When they needed to interact, their words were short, laden with contempt, as if addressing someone from the cleaning staff was a degrading task. Patrick, in particular, seemed to relish his position of power. On one occasion, seeing James organizing cleaning supplies in a closet in the hallway, he stopped and casually remarked, "I hope you know your place, Raymond. Here, everyone has their role, and yours is quite clear, don't you think?" James simply nodded, swallowing the indignation that was growing inside him. Amid laughter, tasteless jokes, and looks of superiority, the group of the cruel dominated the environment. They were like predators, always on the lookout to exploit any weakness or difference. James realized that the problem was not just individual, it was cultural. Their behavior seemed to be tolerated, perhaps even encouraged, by others who remained silent or avoided getting involved. James continued to work in silence, observing every detail and gathering information. Each racist comment, each classist joke, each disdainful look was like a piece of a puzzle he was putting together. Although Raymond's role placed him in a vulnerable position, he knew that as James Walker, he had the power to transform that environment. But for that, he needed to wait for the right moment. And as he listened to the laughter echoing through the hallways, he vowed to himself that this group of cruel individuals would not go unpunished. That morning, the main hall was prepared for an important meeting. The room, with its large windows revealing a stunning view of the city, was immaculate as always. Executives and managers took their places around a long glass table, while state-of-the-art screens displayed graphs and financial projections. James, in his disguise as Raymond, discreetly observed while carrying out his cleaning routine in the nearby corridors, always attentive to the events happening around him. The meeting began without incident. Patrick led the presentation, speaking with his typical exaggerated confidence. Kelly, Sarah, and Mike occupied strategic seats around the table, forming a visible block of influence. As the graphs changed on the screen and discussions intensified, James continued his work, maintaining the posture of invisibility that janitors were forced to adopt in that environment. Then it happened. Patrick, in a gesture that seemed accidental, but that James knew was deliberate, spilled a cup of black coffee on the floor, right in the center of the room. The liquid flowed across the marble floor, creating a stain that immediately drew everyone's attention. "Oh, what a clumsy mistake," Patrick said with a false tone of remorse. He raised his eyes toward the door and saw James. "Raymond, can you take care of this?" He pointed to the stain with an impatient gesture. James knew that this was a calculated provocation, but he remained calm. He grabbed the mop and bucket that were near the entrance and entered the room. All eyes were on him as he knelt down to start cleaning the floor. The initial silence soon gave way to muffled laughter. He felt the weight of the stares and the humiliation, but forced himself to focus on the task, moving the cloth in firm, controlled motions. It was then that Kelly, with her characteristic tone of superiority, decided to speak. "At least he knows his place," she said, her words cutting through the silence like a blade. The room erupted in laughter. Sarah shook her head with a mocking smile, while Mike let out a loud, unrestrained laugh. Patrick, as usual, merely watched with a condescending smile, pleased with the spectacle he had provoked. James continued to clean, feeling a wave of anger and indignation rise within him. But he did not look up. He did not give them the satisfaction of seeing any reaction beyond the professional composure he maintained. Meanwhile, he noticed something different. Some younger employees, scattered around the corners of the room, were not laughing. Their faces showed discomfort and embarrassment, but they remained silent, perhaps out of fear of contradicting their superiors or becoming the next targets. The moment dragged on longer than it should have, with laughter echoing as James finished cleaning the stain. He slowly stood up, holding the bucket firmly, and headed for the door. Before leaving, he cast a brief glance at Kelly, Patrick, Sarah, and Mike. It was not a look of submission, but of determination, something they, wrapped in their bubble of arrogance, failed to perceive. Outside, as he poured the dirty water into the bucket, James took a deep breath. Every gesture and every word of that humiliation were etched in his mind. He knew he needed to maintain his disguise for a little longer, but moments like that made the desire to act grow exponentially. It was not just about him. It was about all the employees who faced that kind of treatment daily, without a voice or power to resist. The building was almost empty. The clock marked the end of the workday, and the executive floors, so vibrant and noisy during the day, were now immersed in a silence broken only by James's footsteps and the sound of his careful movements as he cleaned one of the meeting rooms. The cold ceiling lights reflected on the spotless floor, and the tranquility of the environment contrasted with the day's events, which still echoed in his mind. James took advantage of these moments of calm to reflect, but that night, this peace would be interrupted once again. The door to the room swung open forcefully, revealing Sarah, visibly irritated and in a hurry. She entered without even acknowledging James's presence, her heels striking hard against the floor as she scanned the room with her eyes. Her tone was laden with impatience as she exclaimed, "Where is it? I'm sure I left it here." James stopped cleaning and watched as she began to open drawers and rummage through the papers on the table. Sarah, without even glancing at him, finally noticed his presence. Without a shred of courtesy, she took the bag hanging from her shoulder and threw it to the floor with a brusque gesture. "Look here. My phone must be somewhere," she ordered, as if speaking to an object rather than a person. James stood still for a moment, feeling indignation rise like a wave. He looked at the bag lying on the floor, an object that seemed to symbolize Sarah's complete lack of respect. Despite this, he bent down, maintaining his composure, and began to search. He rummaged through the contents while she drummed her fingers on the table, impatiently murmuring words he couldn't fully distinguish, but whose tone conveyed disdain. After a few minutes, James found the phone. He stood up and extended it to Sarah, who took it from his hand without even raising her eyes or saying thank you. Instead, she muttered something in an almost inaudible tone, but he understood perfectly. If only they knew how to speak properly, it would be faster. The phrase hit like a blow. It was not just a disrespectful comment. It was steeped in prejudice, as if her perception of James as a janitor was synonymous with ignorance or incompetence. He stood still for a few seconds, looking at her as she adjusted the phone in her bag and left the room without looking back, her heels echoing once again down the empty corridor. When the door closed, silence returned to fill the space, but now it felt heavier. James took a deep breath, feeling the weight of yet another deliberate humiliation. He knew that Sarah did not consider him a person. To her, he was merely a function, someone without a voice, without a face, without value beyond the work he did. This perception, shared by many on the upper floors, was at the heart of the problem he had committed to expose and resolve. James bent down again, this time to finish cleaning the room. But as he wiped the floor, his thoughts were far away. He did not feel defeated. On the contrary, he felt his determination solidifying. Every insult, every act of disrespect, every look of superiority fueled his purpose. When it was time to turn off the lights and leave, James looked at the empty room one last time, as if imprinting that moment in his memory. He knew that the outcome was near, and Sarah, like all the others responsible for that toxic environment, would face the consequences of her actions. As he walked down the corridor toward the storage room to put away the equipment, James remembered something Mary had told him at the beginning. "You'll get used to it soon." He smiled faintly. No, he would not get used to it. And thanks to the power he carried silently, no one else would have to. The morning began differently at the main building of Walker Innovations. A mandatory meeting had been called for all employees, without exceptions. The rumor that something important was about to happen spread through the halls, but no one knew exactly why. Kelly, Patrick, Sarah, and Mike, suspicious, arrived early and sat close to the front, as was typical of those who saw themselves as part of the company's elite. Other employees, including janitors and administrative assistants, slowly filled the remaining seats, curious and anxious. The main hall was packed, and the buzz of voices filled the air. Then, the double doors opened, and all eyes turned to the entrance. James Walker, now in his true identity, entered accompanied by his personal assistant. He wore a flawless suit, perfectly tailored, that seemed to reflect the light in the room, a stark contrast to the simple clothes he had worn as Raymond. Upon seeing him, the whispers ceased almost immediately. His presence was unmistakable, even to those who had never interacted directly with the owner of the company. James walked with firm steps toward the stage. The hall fell into absolute silence as he climbed the steps and stopped in the center, adjusting the microphone. He looked at the audience, his eyes scanning each face. When he raised his hand and removed the cap he was holding, revealing his identity, the impact was palpable. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. "My name is James Walker," he began, his voice resonating through the hall with authority. "And I am the owner of this company." The shock was visible on the faces of many, but especially on those of Kelly, Patrick, Sarah, and Mike. They exchanged bewildered glances, trying to process what was happening. James paused, allowing the revelation to settle before continuing. "In the past few weeks, I have worked here among you, not as CEO, but as a janitor," he said, his tone serious. "Raymond was my disguise. I wanted to see, with my own eyes, how this company, my company, really operates. What I discovered was disturbing." He paused again, this time looking directly at the four who had contributed to the toxic environment. "I witnessed acts of disrespect, humiliation, and prejudice. I saw employees being treated as invisible, as if their worth was determined only by their position or appearance. Worse still, some of you behaved in ways that go against everything this company should represent." James then began to detail the events. He spoke about Kelly and her sarcastic comments, about Patrick deliberately bumping into him, about Sarah throwing her bag on the floor and insulting him with loaded words of prejudice, and about Mike, whose cruel jokes had come at the expense of the janitors. As he described each incident, the tension in the room increased. Many employees were visibly uncomfortable, while others, especially the janitors and frontline workers, seemed to struggle to hide smiles of relief and satisfaction. "This was not just an experiment," James continued, looking at everyone seriously. "It was a test to see if the values we preach as a company were truly practiced. And the result was clear. Many of you failed miserably. You forgot something fundamental. Everyone here deserves dignity, regardless of their role or appearance. Everyone contributes to the success of this organization." The faces of Kelly, Patrick, Sarah, and Mike were pale. They knew the mask had fallen, and there was no excuse or justification they could offer for their behavior. James turned his attention directly to them. "You four," he said firmly. "You exemplified the worst of what any workplace can be. Your acts of disrespect and your arrogance have no place here. And I assure you that, starting today, this will change." James then turned to the rest of the audience. "For those who observed these behaviors and said nothing, I also have a message. Silence is complicity. This company needs leaders who advocate for respect and equality, not bystanders who allow disrespect to thrive." The silence that filled the main hall after James Walker's revelation still lingered in the air when he returned to the stage. The weight of the moment was palpable, and everyone knew that the next words would be decisive. James adjusted the microphone, his eyes scanning the audience once more. He seemed to be measuring each face, looking for not only the guilty but also the silent and those who had been victims. "Now that all of you know the truth, it's time to act," he began, his voice firm, yet maintaining a tone of seriousness. "My company is not a place for arrogance, prejudice, or disrespect. Those who contributed to the toxic environment I witnessed here have no place in Walker Innovations anymore." James turned to Kelly, Patrick, Sarah, and Mike, who were seated in the front row. All four avoided eye contact, their expressions alternating between shock and embarrassment. "Kelly, Patrick, Sarah, and Mike," he said, pausing for their names to resonate in the room. "You are all fired. Your actions, attitudes, and words have demonstrated an ethical and moral failure incompatible with the values this company must represent." The impact was immediate. Kelly tried to stand up, perhaps to protest, but James raised his hand authoritatively, cutting off any attempt at justification. "There is no excuse for what you did. You not only disrespected your colleagues, you betrayed the trust of this company and everything it should represent. Your terminations are effective immediately." Patrick, who always carried an imposing demeanor, seemed to have wilted in his chair. Sarah was frozen, her face red with humiliation, while Mike simply stared at the floor, unable to face anyone. James continued, now looking at the rest of the audience. Others here have also been complicit, whether by action or by omission. And for those individuals, there will also be consequences. My HR team has already reviewed recent reports and behaviors, and those who contributed to this culture of disrespect will receive termination notices later today. A murmur began to spread through the room, but James quickly interrupted. If you know you are being called to account, it may be because you chose the wrong side, the side of arrogance, prejudice, and disrespect. Here, that will no longer be tolerated. With the guilty identified, James turned to those who had been victims of the system he had exposed. Now I want to speak to you, he said, looking directly at the janitors who occupied the seats at the back. You have been treated as invisible, as if your contribution to this company had no value. But I see you. I have always seen you. And that is going to change. James then announced a series of promotions and changes. Each of you, who have suffered from disrespect and humiliation, will receive an opportunity for growth. You will be promoted to administrative roles, with the necessary training to achieve the success you deserve. This company will be a place where every person, regardless of their role, can progress and be treated with the dignity they deserve. The janitors were stunned. Mary, who had always been a resilient and warm figure, had tears in her eyes. Some of the younger ones, who had learned to accept silence as their only defense, now exchanged glances with smiles of hope and relief. James concluded with a resolute tone. I assure you that the culture of this company will be transformed. Starting today, we will implement mandatory training on ethics and respect in the workplace. Every employee will be evaluated not only on their technical competence, but also on their ability to contribute to a positive and inclusive environment. This company will not only be a place of technological innovation, but of humanity. As James stepped down from the stage, the hall was filled with a mix of emotions. There was shock, relief, satisfaction, and even pride on some faces. The message was clear. Walker Innovations was entering a new era, and James was determined to lead the way to ensure that every person there had their value recognized. As security escorted Kelly, Patrick, Sarah, and Mike out of the building, applause began timidly and soon grew in intensity. It was not just for James, but for everyone who believed in justice, respect, and dignity in the workplace. James looked at Mary and the other janitors at the back of the room and smiled. They were no longer invisible, and they would never be again. A few weeks later, the headquarters of Walker Innovations was unrecognizable, not in its physical appearance. The hallways gleamed as always, the glass walls reflecting the natural light that flooded the upper floors. The most significant transformation was in the people. The team, now renewed and inclusive, displayed a different energy, a lightness in their smiles, and a new dynamic of mutual respect that was palpable. The change was not just structural, it was cultural. James Walker had fulfilled his promise to reform not only the policies, but also the values of the company. To mark this new era, James organized a special event. The event room, simply but elegantly decorated, was filled with employees from all sectors and hierarchical levels. From managers to the newest hires, everyone was present. Unlike in the past, there were no invisible divisions between groups. People from different departments mingled, talked, and laughed together, reflecting the new culture that James had implemented. When James took the stage, the room fell silent. Dressed in a sharp suit, but with a warm smile that conveyed closeness, he looked at the audience and began to speak. His voice was firm, but laden with emotion. Today is not just a day to celebrate what we have achieved so far, he began, pausing to let the words resonate. It is a day to remember who we are and what we want to be as a company. In recent months, we have learned hard lessons. We realize that a company's success is not just in the products it creates or the profits it generates. It lies in the people who build it every day. James paused, taking a deep breath. Success is collective. A company only grows when everyone's value is recognized. From the intern to the executive, from the programmer to the maintenance staff, everyone plays a crucial role. And more importantly, everyone deserves respect. The audience applauded warmly, But James raised his hand, asking for silence. We cannot forget the lessons we have learned. We cannot go back to what we were before. We must be an example of inclusion, empathy, and leadership. And I want everyone to know that from now on, this will not just be a goal. It will be our essence. As he spoke, Mary, the cleaning staff member who had been an essential guide during James's disguise, was sitting at the back of the room. Her eyes sparkled, but she maintained her humble posture, as she always did. However, James had something special planned for her. Before I conclude, I want to recognize someone very special, he said, looking directly at Mary, who immediately felt the eyes turn towards her. When I entered this company disguised as Raymond, there was one person who treated me with dignity from the very first moment, who patiently taught me and showed me what true dedication to work looks like. Mary, please come to the stage. Mary hesitated, surprised and a bit embarrassed, but the applause and encouragement from the room made her stand up. With slow but steady steps, she walked to the stage, where James welcomed her with a warm smile. He held her hands and turned to the audience. Mary is the living example of what it means to lead with empathy and respect. Even without knowing who I really was, she treated me as an equal, as part of the team. And today, I want to recognize her dedication in a way that reflects the importance of everything she represents. James turned to Mary. Mary, from today on, you are the head of the maintenance department of this company. Your work and leadership are invaluable, and I know you will inspire your team just as you inspired me. Additionally, as a token of gratitude, you will receive a special bonus for all the years of dedication you have brought to Walker Innovations. The room erupted in applause and cheers of approval. Mary, visibly emotional, tried to speak, but her words were lost amid tears. James embraced her, and the audience rose in a standing ovation, celebrating that moment that perfectly encapsulated the new era of the company. As the event came to an end, the prevailing feeling was one of hope. James walked among the employees, talking to everyone, ensuring that his presence was not just that of a leader, but of someone who believed in the value of each individual present. He knew that the road ahead would require constant work, but he was confident that together they could uphold the promise of a fairer and more respectful environment. Under the renewed leadership of James Walker, Walker Innovations thrived not only financially, but also as a model of transformed corporate culture. The lesson learned there would never be forgotten. Respect and dignity are the true pillars of success.
If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. These other stories will also move you. Click to continue watching.